I was born into the Catholic faith, a world of sacred rituals and unwavering devotion that shaped every corner of my existence. From the moment I could speak, my parents taught me prayers that echoed through generations, whispered to the heavens like an eternal hymn. Our house was adorned with symbols of our belief. Rosaries hung delicately on walls, saints gazing serenely from pictures, candles flickering in quiet devotion. Faith was not just a belief, it was the air we breathed. Sundays were not ordinary days. They were sanctified moments when we gathered at church to partake in the Mass, a sacred rhythm that bound us to something greater. I can still remember the scent of incense wafting through the pews, the solemn chants of the priest, the awe that filled me as sunlight poured through stained glass windows. It felt like God Himself was speaking to us, through every word of Scripture, every act of ritual. My parents, devout Catholics through and through, lived their lives as models of obedience to the Church. They revered the Pope, not as a mere leader, but as the chosen successor of St. Peter, divinely appointed to guide Christ's Church on earth. Their respect for him was boundless, unwavering, as though his words carried the voice of God Himself. Naturally, they passed that reverence down to me. In our family, faith meant adherence. We adhered to the teachings of the Church with an unyielding loyalty, believing that obedience was our path to salvation. Confession was sacred. I learned early the solemn act of kneeling before a priest, voicing my sins, and receiving absolution. It wasn't just an obligation. It was my lifeline to redemption. Receiving the Eucharist, lighting candles for the saints, reciting the Rosary, all these rituals were woven into the fabric of our existence as though they were keys to unlock heaven's gates. Faith was our anchor. The Church was our rock, and I stood firmly upon that rock, believing with all my heart that as long as I obeyed, as long as I followed without question, I was on the right path. But Gabriel, the man I would become, could not remain untouched by life's currents forever. Beneath the surface of my unwavering faith, seeds of doubt lay dormant, waiting for the right storm to awaken them. What if my faith was not about rituals? What if salvation was not earned by adherence? These questions were faint whispers, drowned out by the louder voice of tradition. And then came the day that changed everything. It started unremarkably. Another day in the life of devotion. The alarm clock chimed at dawn, and I rose from my bed as I always did. Prayer book in hand, I whispered my morning prayers before stepping into the rush of daily routine. There were no signs of forewarning, no visions or dreams to prepare me. If anything, that day felt more ordinary than most. And yet, within hours, my understanding of the world, and beyond, would be shattered beyond recognition. As morning turned to afternoon, I busied myself with tasks, all the while carrying an unspoken sense of certainty that life was predictable, safe, and steadfast, just like my faith. But then came the first pang, a tightening in my chest, subtle at first, as though someone were gripping my ribcage with invisible hands. I dismissed it as nothing more than a passing discomfort. Perhaps I'd eaten too fast, or strained a muscle bending over a task. But as the minutes passed, the sensation escalated. It was no longer just tightness, it was pressure, growing more intense with every heartbeat. My breaths grew shallow, my pulse thundered in my ears like an urgent drumbeat. Something was wrong. I tried to dismiss the thought, tried to assure myself that it was nothing serious. Yet doubt crept in. My legs felt weak, the room began to spin, and panic surged through me like cold electricity. I stumbled toward a chair, gasping for breath, clutching my chest as the tightness transformed into searing pain. My knees buckled. I fell to the floor, no longer able to resist the weight of my collapsing body. Around me, voices rose in alarm. Footsteps scrambled toward me. Someone shouted my name. Hands touched my shoulders in frantic attempts to assess what was happening, but I could no longer respond. My tongue was heavy, my vision blurred, and then darkness. It was a silence unlike any I had known before. No sound, no sensation, just a void that swallowed everything. For a moment, I thought I had blacked out, that my body was simply shutting down. But then came the realization that would change my life forever. I was not in my body anymore. The events that followed, the moments that would redefine everything I thought I knew, are no longer just recollections. They have become the very foundation of the man I am, the Gabriel who was given a glimpse of eternity and returned with a truth that cannot be denied. There's something comforting about the predictable rhythm of a well-worn routine. I woke up that morning as I had so many other mornings, greeted by the faint orange glow of sunlight spilling through the lace curtains of my bedroom window. My alarm clock hummed softly, a gentle reminder of the start of another day. Stretching lazily, I whispered my morning prayers, words that had been ingrained into my soul since childhood. "Thank you for another day," I murmured. At the time, I didn't realize how those words would echo back to me in ways I could never have anticipated. Sliding out of bed, I felt the cool wood floors beneath my feet and hurried to get ready. My morning ritual was like clockwork: quick shower, a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, and then grabbing my prayer book before stepping out into the day. There was a serenity in these small habitual acts. It gave me a sense of stability in a world that often felt chaotic. As I walked the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I noticed the usual sights. Mrs. Caravello from across the street was watering her roses, the vivid red petals glistening with dew. Children laughed as they chased each other around their front yards, their backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders as they dawdled on their way to school. Everything seemed so normal, so secure. My destination, as always, was the church, a modest yet beautiful structure, its bell tower rising as a steadfast guardian of our small community. I loved the sound of the bells. They had rung for as long as I could remember, marking the hours with a comforting regularity that reminded me of God's omnipresence. Entering the church, the familiar scent of incense greeted me, warm and inviting. My footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor as I made my way to the pew where I always sat, midway down on the left side. I knelt, as I always did, and began to pray. But as I whispered my devotions, there was an unexpected flicker of unease, subtle but undeniable. It was a feeling that I couldn't quite place, as if a stray thread had come loose in the tapestry of my life. I brushed it aside, attributing it to fatigue or perhaps just the monotony of my daily routine. After all, faith is steadfast, isn't it? And my life was built on the solid rock of that faith. I had no reason to doubt it. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. I ran errands, helped out at the parish office, and spent time conversing with Father Anthony, our beloved priest, who had been a mentor to me for years. His wisdom and unwavering commitment to the faith had always been a source of inspiration. We spoke about the upcoming feast day, the preparations for which were well underway. It was a typical day in every sense, marked by routine and the kind of quiet, unassuming acts that often define a life. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I began to notice something was wrong. I was standing in line at the local bakery, chatting casually with a friend when it happened. Strange sensation, a tightness in my chest, almost like I'd swallowed something too large. I placed a hand over my heart, willing it to pass. "Are you okay?" my friend asked, concern flickering in her eyes. I smiled weakly and nodded. "It's nothing," I said. But deep down, a shadow of doubt began to creep into my mind. The tightness didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, spreading outward across my rib cage like a vine tightening its grip. My breathing became shallow, and I struggled to focus on the conversation around me. It was as if the world was dimming, losing its color and clarity. Panic began to set in. "Gabriel?" My friend's voice sounded distant, as though coming from the other end of a long tunnel. "You don't look well." I think I need to sit down," I mumbled, my words slurring slightly. My legs felt weak, trembling beneath me as though they might give way at any moment. The bakery seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as darkness crept into the edges of my vision. Someone, a stranger perhaps, helped me to a nearby chair, their hands steadying me as my knees buckled. I could hear the muffled sounds of voices around me, urgent and alarmed, but their words blurred together in a cacophony of noise that my brain couldn't process. My chest burned now, the pain radiating like fire, each heartbeat pounding against the confines of my ribs. And then suddenly I fell. Not physically, though my body slumped into the chair like a marionette with its strings cut. It was something deeper, something I can only describe as a falling away from myself. The world faded, and all at once there was silence. No pain, no voices, no bakery, just an all-encompassing void. The next thing I knew, I was standing, or at least I felt as though I was standing, in a space that wasn't quite space at all. I looked around, disoriented. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just an expanse of infinite blackness that stretched endlessly in every direction. My heart, or whatever part of me still resembled a heart, pounded in my chest. I was weightless, untethered, and completely alone. Then I saw it. The scene played out before me like a surreal, distorted movie. There was my body, slumped in the chair, surrounded by a crowd of people, their faces etched with concern. My friend knelt beside me, her hand pressed firmly against my chest as she shouted instructions to someone out of view. I saw the paramedics arrive, their bright uniforms like beacons in the chaos. They worked furiously, their voices sharp and commanding as they tried to bring me back. But I wasn't there. I was here, wherever here was. I tried to move toward them, to reach out and touch the shoulder of the paramedic closest to me, but my hand passed right through him as though he were made of smoke. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. "I'm here!" I screamed, but no sound came out. My voice, if I even had one, was swallowed by the void. "Please, I'm here. Don't stop. Don't let me go." But they couldn't hear me. They couldn't see me. The realization hit like a blow to the chest. I wasn't in the world anymore. I wasn't in my body, and if the paramedics failed, I would never be again. There was no easy way to describe the feeling of leaving my own body. It wasn't like sleep, where the mind drifts into a space of dreams and imagination. It wasn't like fainting, where darkness swallows the senses in a sudden, suffocating rush. No, this was something entirely different. This was detachment, a separation of everything I knew to be me from the vessel that carried me through the world. When I first realized I was no longer in my body, disbelief clung to me like fog. It wasn't possible, was it? I wasn't supposed to be standing upright, watching paramedics frantically work to revive the lifeless figure lying on the ground. And yet, there I was. I wasn't in the bakery anymore. Not really. Not in the way I had been only moments ago. Everything looked so much sharper, more distinct, as if reality had been pulled into focus for the first time. My surroundings shimmered, not physically, but with an energy I couldn't explain. I tried to move, but my steps were weightless, like walking on air. There was no sensation of my feet touching the ground, no familiar ache in my limbs, no heartbeat echoing in my chest. Panic gripped me, but it didn't feel the way panic normally does. No racing pulse, no tightening in my throat. It was a cold, numbing fear, the kind that crawled under the skin of your existence. Then I saw my body. It was a shocking sight, one that no amount of preparation could brace me for. I watched as the paramedics hovered over me, their movements quick and calculated. One placed his hands firmly over my chest, pressing down in rhythmic bursts. Another attached wires and tubes to machines that beeped incessantly, filling the room with urgency. It wasn't just the physical sight of my body that unsettled me, it was the realization of separation. That person on the ground, That body wasn't me anymore. I couldn't feel the pain that should have been radiating from it, couldn't sense the weight of the world pressing down on it. It was just there, empty, motionless. And I was here, standing apart from it, watching as strangers fought to pull it back to life. I tried to speak, to cry out and tell them I was still here, but no sound left my lips. When I reached out to touch the shoulder of a paramedic, my hand passed through him like smoke. They couldn't see me, they couldn't hear me. I was invisible, insubstantial, a ghost, perhaps, or something close to it. I had never believed in ghosts. But what else could I call myself now? And then it began. The pull. It wasn't physical, not in the way gravity tugs at our bodies or the way wind pushes against us. It was something deeper, something unexplainable, a force I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. It wrapped itself around me, drawing me forward, or was it backward? Perhaps in every direction at once. My surroundings blurred, the bakery dissolving into a swirl of colorless mist. I couldn't fight it, though I tried. I reached for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. No walls, no ground, no air, just emptiness. The pull grew stronger, faster, and I felt as though I was being dragged through dimensions I couldn't comprehend. The mist thickened, and before long, all I could see was darkness. It was the kind of darkness that wasn't just an absence of light. It was alive. It shifted and pulsed around me, an abyss that stretched infinitely. It wasn't just a void, it felt like a presence. Something or someone was there, watching. I was consumed by the thought that I might stay here forever, floating in this strange, unyielding darkness. Was this death? Was this the end of everything I had ever known? I tried to call out, but my voice didn't work the way it used to. Instead of sound, my words came from somewhere deeper, straight from my soul. "Help me," I cried. "Please, someone help me." The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, heavy, almost deafening in its stillness. The darkness closed in, tightening its grip on me, until despair threatened to consume me whole. And then I saw it, a light. It was faint at first, a small pinprick glowing in the distance, but as I focused on it, the light grew stronger, brighter, expanding rapidly until it cut through the darkness like a blade. It wasn't just light, it was warmth. I could feel it radiating toward me, melting away the cold void that had surrounded me moments ago. Something about the light filled me with hope, a feeling I hadn't expected to feel again. I wasn't alone. There was something, or someone, out there. The light pulled me closer, growing larger with each passing second, until it engulfed me entirely. And then I saw him, Jesus Christ. He stood at the center of the light, his presence so overwhelming that I fell to my knees instinctively. It wasn't fear that brought me to my knees, it was awe. His eyes, piercing yet filled with immeasurable love, looked straight into my soul. He saw everything, every thought, every mistake, every secret. In his gaze there was no hiding. There was only truth. "Lord, have mercy on me," I whispered. The words felt inadequate, as though they couldn't possibly express the depth of what I was feeling. But the moment I spoke, something inside me broke open. Every sin, every failure, every doubt rose to the surface, as if they couldn't remain hidden in his presence. He spoke my name, Gabriel. It wasn't just a sound, it was a resonance that shook every part of my existence. His voice carried a weight I couldn't describe, as though it wasn't just his voice. It was the voice of the one who had created me, who had been there all along, even when I hadn't realized it. "You have lived your life with faith," he said, "but your faith has been placed in men rather than in me." The words hit me like a tidal wave, and I tried to respond, to defend myself. I wanted to explain that I had followed his church, his teachings, that I had done everything I was supposed to do. But before I could say anything, he raised his hand, and in an instant everything changed. The brilliant light dissolved, and my surroundings shifted, twisting and reforming into something entirely new. I was no longer in the presence of Jesus. I was somewhere else, somewhere that would redefine everything I thought I knew. In that timeless moment, I found myself suspended between nothingness and a brilliance that defied description. For what seemed like an eternity, I floated in an abyss, a vast, endless darkness that was not merely an absence of light, but an entity in its own right. It roiled around me like a living shadow, pressing in from all sides with an intensity that threatened to devour whatever hope remained in me. I remember feeling as if every thought and every memory was being pulled apart at the seams. In the midst of that overwhelming blackness, the despair was visceral. I sensed my very essence teetering on the edge of oblivion. There was an agonizing loneliness in that void, a silence so complete that it drowned out the frantic beating of my heart. In that desolation, I felt small, utterly insignificant before an infinite expanse that neither cared about my existence nor offered even the slightest reassurance of what was to come. But then, just as the overwhelming dread threatened to consume me entirely, a subtle glow began to emerge. At first, it was little more than a feeble pinprick on the horizon of my perception, but its persistence was undeniable. Slowly, imperceptibly at times, that light grew in intensity and warmth. It was as if the abyss itself was recoiling, pushed back by the relentless advance of this pure, radiant energy. The light did not merely illuminate the darkness around me, it transformed it. Shadows gave way to a soft luminescence that seemed to beckon me forward. I felt drawn toward it, compelled in a way that defied logic. With every fiber of my being, I yearned to reach out and merge with that comforting glow. It was not a force of fear or judgment. On the contrary, it resonated with an overwhelming sense of compassion and reassurance. The light was gentle, like the caress of a long-lost embrace, soothing the raw edges of my terror. It whispered promises of hope and renewal, stirring in me the faint embers of a faith long thought extinguished. My journey through the darkness was both physical and spiritual. As I moved toward the growing light, the oppressive weight of the abyss began to lift. The pull of that radiant energy was decisive. It carried me along like a current, guiding me away from the chaos that had once threatened to overwhelm me. I was no longer drifting aimlessly. I was on a path that felt both inevitable and divinely orchestrated. And then, as I drew nearer to the source of the light, I recognized the figure at its center once more. There, emerging resolutely against the shimmering backdrop, stood Jesus Christ. His presence was as commanding as it was tender, an embodiment of both divine authority and intimate love. In that luminous space, all the fears of my earthly life melted away. My eyes widened in awe as I took in the details that radiated from him. Every aspect of his countenance carried a deep, sorrowful understanding, tempered by an unwavering kindness that seemed to embrace every sorrow and every sin that I had ever known. "Gabriel," he spoke, his voice issuing not merely as sound, but as a profound vibration within my soul. In that single word, I understood that he was reaching out to the very core of who I was, inviting me to step beyond the bounds of mortal limitations. His eyes held mine, and in their depths I saw the reflection of my most hidden truths, failings I had long concealed, hopes I had abandoned, and a love I had forgotten was possible. The light around him pulsed in time with his words, each beat echoing a promise of redemption and transformation. In that moment, the contrast between the abyss and the light could no longer be more distinct. The darkness, which had represented despair, was receding, banished by the radiance of divine love. Yet it was only by having traversed that despair that I could truly understand the magnitude of the light's gift. I felt as if every emotion was heightened, the ache of past regrets mingled with a sudden, joyous clarity that flooded my entire being. The abyss had shown me the fragility of the human condition, the precarious nature of life and death. But the light reaffirmed what I had once known instinctively, that within even the deepest void lies the potential for rebirth. It reassured me that despite the chaos and pain of the world, there is a divine spark that can guide us back to the truth. Jesus extended his hand, and I reached out without hesitation. In that ineffable moment of contact, I experienced a warmth that transcended the physical, a deep communion that filled every fragment of my soul. The boundaries that separated me from the divine melted away, and I was left feeling both humbled and emboldened. It was as if I had been given a second chance, a new perspective that challenged everything I had ever taken for granted about life and the nature of faith. Yet, even as the brilliance of the light brought solace, I knew that this journey was not yet complete. The vision before me was both a promise and a portent, a reminder that while I had been delivered from the clutches of the abyss, my ultimate task was only just beginning. The clarity of the light and the gentle pressure of Jesus' guidance underscored the truth that I was now charged with a calling. I was to carry the memory of that divine encounter back into the world of the living, transformed, yet burdened with the profound responsibility of sharing what I had seen. As I stood there, enveloped in the glow that transcended all understanding, I began to sense the subtle movement of time once more. The edge of the luminous realm hinted at the threshold of return, a passage back to the world I had momentarily left behind. But even as that thought emerged, I felt no resistance, only the quiet assurance that my life had been irrevocably changed. The abyss might have been vast and terrifying, but the light had proven that hope is never truly lost. And in that sacred space between darkness and radiance, I embraced the new reality that was slowly unfolding before me, a reality where embracing the divine meant accepting both the shadows of our past and the promise of emerging into the light. In the wake of my luminous encounter, when the mystery of the divine light had begun to reforge the boundaries of my understanding, I found myself thrust into another vision, a vision so raw and unsettling that it shattered the very foundation of faith I had built my life upon. The echoes of that transcendent light still reverberated within me, yet now I was led into realms where the hallowed halls of the church were distorted by a darkness I had never imagined could dwell within them. I stood on the threshold of a vast, imposing cathedral, its once sacred interior now marred by an oppressive atmosphere. The elaborate stained glass windows, which had always bathed our revered rituals in ethereal hues, now seemed to cast harsh judgmental colors upon everything beneath them. In this vision, I witnessed the veiled workings of those who held power, a cabal of cardinals, bishops, and other high-ranking church officials who moved with a purpose that was far removed from the humble devotion I remembered from my childhood. They assembled in secret chambers, their faces illuminated by the sickly glow of candlelight, rather than the sanctity of divine fire. As I drifted closer, the sounds of hushed voices and the clink of gold and silver filled the air. I watched in disbelief as these men exchanged envelopes filled with money and secret documents. Their conversation was barely audible, punctuated by furtive glances and the rustle of expensive robes. Every gesture, every whispered word, cut deeply into the beliefs I had held since I was a child. I recalled the heartfelt sermons, the earnest prayers, and the absolute trust I had once placed in these institutions, now tainted by greed and manipulation. The vision shifted, and suddenly I was transported into another chamber, a grand hall of opulence, reminiscent of a Vatican treasure room. Massive pillars of polished marble encased the room, and golden ornaments adorned every surface. Yet even in this display of magnificence there was an unmistakable stain, the unspoken exchange of power. Here I observed a pope, resplendent in his ornate vestments, seated upon an elaborately carved throne. But his eyes were distant and calculating, not the warm, guiding presence I had believed them to be. He engaged in a silent dialogue with shadowy figures, his hands moving in subtle gestures that spoke of decisions made for self-aggrandizement rather than the service of God. As I watched, my heart pounded with a sense of betrayal that felt almost physical. I remembered the unwavering conviction of my youth, the belief that the church was a manifestation of divine truth, a beacon that would lead the faithful to eternal salvation. Now, the images before me revealed a terrifying dichotomy. The pure essence of faith, centered on personal connection to the divine, had been swallowed by centuries of human ambition and corruption. The sacred rituals, once a source of comfort and connection, had become nothing more than tools for maintaining control over the masses. In that moment, my inner foundation began to crack. I had always taken solace in the idea that faith was immutable, a constant amidst the chaos of earthly life. Yet the vision forced me to question everything I had known. The church, with all its traditions, its solemn rites, and its revered leaders, no longer appeared as the divine institution I had clung to. Instead, I saw ambition cloaked in sanctity, and I understood that the true message of the divine had been obscured by layers of worldly influence. The rituals, which once represented a direct communion with God, now seemed like elaborate performances designed to distract the faithful from the harsh realities of power and greed. As these images swirled before my eyes, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. How could I reconcile the comforting faith of my childhood with this scandalous distortion of what was meant to be the house of God? Confusion and heartbreak intermingled in my chest, and I recalled every moment of devotion I had ever offered, each prayer, each silent reflection, and wondered if those moments had been manipulated into a tool for subjugation. The rigid structures I had trusted were not the immutable truth I had envisioned, but rather fragile facades concealing human failings. In this state of profound disillusionment, I felt my old faith shatter like fragile glass under immense pressure. The foundation I had built was eroded by the bitter taste of hypocrisy and betrayal. Yet in that process there emerged a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, a realization that the essence of true faith was not in the institution or its rituals, but in the personal connection between the individual and the divine. The pure, unmediated expression of spirituality that I had once known was still present, hidden beneath the corrupt veneer of organized religion. I struggled to comprehend the scale of what I had seen, the power wielded by those in authority, the clandestine pacts forged in dimly lit rooms, and the staggering disparity between what was preached and what was practiced shook me to my very core. It was as if the comforting image of divinity I had clung to was being pulled apart, replaced by a raw, unapologetic truth about the corruptibility of man. I could no longer look at the church as a monolith of purity. Instead, I was forced to see it as a complex, deeply flawed human institution nourished by both sacred desire and treacherous ambition. In the depths of that vision, as I floated in a realm where time and space lost their meaning, I realized that this shattering of my cherished foundation was painful, yet ultimately necessary. It opened the door for a new perspective, a chance to rebuild my understanding of faith on something untainted by the transgressions of those who claim to lead it. I felt a stirring inside me, a fragile hope that the divine truth I remembered in the light was still accessible, waiting to be reclaimed and purified from the corruption that had overshadowed it. That night, as the echoes of the vision slowly faded, the pain of betrayal gave way to a cautious resolve. I understood that I now carried within me the heavy burden of truth, a truth that, once exposed, could no longer be hidden by the opulence and pomp of tradition. My journey was becoming one of deep introspection, one where I was forced to discern the difference between blind faith and the authentic, personal experience of the divine. And as I stood amid the ruins of my once unshakable foundation, I vowed silently that my search for meaning would no longer be constrained by the corrupted institutions that had once defined my world. In that desperate moment of loss and revelation, I took the first steps toward rebuilding a faith that was mine alone, untainted by the deceptions of men, lit only by the true, unyielding light that I had experienced. In the wake of everything I had witnessed, the corruption, the hidden pacts, and the institutional deception, I found myself yearning for a radically different understanding of what it meant to follow the divine. As the vision of opulent, decaying rituals receded from my mind's eye, a quieter, gentler image began to emerge from the depths of my recollections. It was not one of grand cathedrals or ornate vestments, but of something infinitely simpler and more profound, the true church. I remember the moment as if it were etched in my very soul. I was drawn into yet another vision, one that contrasted so starkly with the decadence of what I had witnessed before. There, in a modest room with bare wooden walls and a simple dirt floor, I saw a small gathering of people. They were not garbed in elaborate robes, nor did they hold symbols of power. Instead, they were ordinary, their eyes gleaming with a raw, unadorned faith. They sat together on humble wooden benches arranged in a loose circle, and the only decoration was the soft glow of a single lamp hovering in the center. In this sacred space there were no ceremonies dictated by rigid dogma, no intercessors standing between the worshiper and the divine. Instead, there was a palpable sense of presence, a serene, unfiltered communion with the Spirit of Jesus. I could feel it in the quiet murmurings of prayer, each individual's heart reaching out with sincere, unmediated emotion. The air was thick with honest devotion, with people simply speaking to Jesus as though he were right there amongst them. There were no intermediaries, no layers of tradition to complicate the message. It was, I realized, as genuine as a whispered secret between the soul and its creator. As I drifted closer, I listened to one man speak aloud, not from a pulpit or with authoritative gestures, but with a voice full of humble conviction. He recounted stories of everyday miracles, the healing of broken hearts, the restoration of hope in the midst of despair, and the beauty found in simple acts of kindness. His words weren't rehearsed or crafted to impress an audience. They were a raw outpouring of lived experience. In that modest group, every utterance was suffused with the kind of love that did not depend on titles or tradition, but on direct and sincere connection to the divine. The vision was a revelation. In that unadorned gathering, I recognized the truth that I had been seeking all along. The true church was not a building defined by its marble columns or gilding, nor was it the result of centuries of accumulated dogma. The true church is the communion of souls, each one a living testament to the presence of God. It is the sense of unity and mutual understanding that arises when people cast aside the need for hierarchical validation and simply open themselves to the Spirit of Jesus. In this church, I observed, there were no barriers between the sacred and the profane. There was only an honest, open heart addressing its Creator. I could feel my own heart swell with a mixture of awe and relief. For so long I had clung to the belief that salvation and divine truth were mediated by grand institutions, their rituals and traditions seemingly infallible, but now all I could see was the simplicity of the divine presence in everyday beings. As Jesus' gentle voice echoed in my memory, repeating the words, "Follow me, not the men," I understood that the true practice of faith is an inward journey, a personal walk with the divine that does not require the embellishments of human authority. In that vision, as I moved among the gathered souls, I noticed how their eyes shone with conviction and tenderness, rather than the cold, detached reverence I had known before. There was an unspoken bond among these people, a unity founded on mutual respect and an unwavering commitment to living by the truth of their faith. Each smile, each gesture of shared understanding reminded me that this was the essence of what it meant to belong to the true church. Here, there was no need for ritualistic formalities. Authenticity was the only creed. The experience left me deeply moved and irrevocably changed. I began to comprehend that my earlier faith had been built on a foundation imposed by tradition and authority, one that allowed little room for the personal inner flame of connection with Jesus. Instead of being stifled by the layers of hierarchical structure, the ones who experienced the church were liberated by their own sincerity. They worshiped through simple acts of love, through genuine conversation, through the comfort of shared silence, and through the honest acknowledgement of their vulnerabilities. Returning from the vision, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The burden of having to conform to established rituals lifted from my shoulders as I embraced the idea that the church was not confined to a building or a lineage of leaders. I carried within me the assurance that the real sanctuary was in the hearts of those who earnestly desired to know and follow Jesus on their own terms. This revelation was both comforting and challenging. It demanded that I question every convention and tradition I had once held sacred. Yet it also invigorated me with a passion to seek out and nurture the authentic spirit of the divine in every encounter. In the silence after the vision, I resolved that I would pursue a path dedicated to fostering this genuine connection, to building a community where faith was grounded in personal experience rather than institutional authority. I would become a messenger of this truth, a living example that the true church is not a relic of the past, but a vibrant, evolving call to live in the light of divine love. And I knew that no matter the obstacles, this understanding was one I could not and would not abandon. The journey ahead was daunting, but I embarked upon it with a heart aflame with hope, a hope that the genuine truth of faith would one day shine through the veneer of tradition, illuminating the lives of those willing to seek the divine in its most authentic form. After emerging from the clarity of the true church, I found a new vision consuming my thoughts, a chilling glimpse into a future where deception would enshroud the hearts of many. In this vision, I saw not only the physical manifestation of false leadership, but also a pervasive spiritual malaise that would rob people of their innate capacity to discern truth. It was as if the divine illumination I once experienced had been eclipsed by an insidious dark tide, one that promised unity and peace while weaving a web of control. I watched as vast crowds assembled in enormous public spaces beneath a sky that seemed both unnaturally vibrant and ominously overcast. Amid the throngs, I identified a singular figure, a man clad in immaculate white robes, whose calm smile belied the storm brewing in his intentions. His presence was magnetic, drawing people as if by an invisible force, and his voice carried the harmony of promises, promises of unity, equality, and an era of everlasting peace. Yet, behind his carefully curated words, I sensed a current of manipulation that would soon twist this hope into a tool for subjugation. The faces in the crowd radiated fervor, but I could also see in their eyes a glimmer of vulnerability that any cunning deceiver might exploit. As the vision unfolded further, scenes of elaborate ceremonies and orchestrated solidarity appeared before me. Government officials and religious dignitaries moved side by side in polished corridors of power, their hands exchanging documents and offers with almost ritualistic precision. These meetings, shrouded in secrecy, hinted at plans that would amalgamate religious dogma with political influence. I saw towns and villages transformed overnight as grand monuments were erected and traditional symbols of faith were repurposed into emblems of this new order, a world where worship was no longer about seeking divine truth, but about pledging allegiance to a system that promised order through deception. In the midst of this orchestrated unity, I heard a voice echo within my mind, a lament reminiscent of the gentle yet firm warnings of Jesus. "Not all who claim to follow me are mine," the voice intoned, resonating with a sorrow that cut through the din of false jubilation. It revealed the heartbreaking irony that many who earnestly believed in the promises of this new leader would be duped into endorsing controlled, artificial harmony. I struggled internally, torn between the hope for a peaceful tomorrow and the dread of falling prey to elaborate subterfuge. Every image in my vision was a stark reminder that beyond the glittering facade lay a calculated manipulation of faith and power. The future deception was not a sudden invasion, but a gradual erosion, where the everyday acts of genuine worship were slowly replaced by rehearsed displays of loyalty, and where the intimate connection to the divine was substituted by an empty institutional creed. I saw families torn apart by disagreements over this emerging dogma, and communities divided by the blind fervor of their leaders. There was a pervasive sense that the essence of worship was being commoditized. Are now tools to enforce conformity, molding the faithful into docile adherents of a new order that cared little for true spiritual communion. In one particularly vivid sequence of the vision, I witnessed a gathering on a grand stage where the new leader addressed a sea of expectant faces. His words, polished to perfection, wove together imagery of a united world, free of conflict and suffering. Yet, beneath this tapestry of eloquence, I discerned a script that was meant to pacify dissent, to dull the critical minds of those who might dare question his authority. I saw monitors displaying serene images that contrasted sharply with the fervor in the crowd, a dissonance that screamed of manufactured consent. It pained me to see how quickly sincere yearning for truth could be overshadowed by the allure of collective illusion. As the images faded, I was left with a gnawing awareness of my responsibility. This fusion was both a prophecy and a warning, a call to vigilance against any force that sought to replace the intimate personal relationship with the divine with a mass-produced, manipulated faith. The vision left me with the bitter realization that the path to salvation was vulnerable, not because the divine was absent, but because human ambition could so easily distort that which was pure. I felt a deep urgency to awaken others, to show them that true faith is not measured by the grandeur of institutions or the charisma of leaders, but by the sincerity of one's heart and the clarity of one's spirit. In that moment of painful foresight, I resolved that I must act as a messenger of truth. I would carry the burden of this revelation, not with bitterness, but with a fierce determination to remind people of the true essence of their spirituality. The future deception I had witnessed was not set in stone. It was a challenge to be met, a crisis that demanded individual reflection and collective courage. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with resistance, as the comforting lies of conformity often outweigh the difficult truth of genuine introspection. Letting this dark vision go unchallenged was a betrayal of the divine spark that dwells within each soul. My heart ached for those who would be misled, for the innocence that would be lost in the tide of orchestrated unity. And as I returned to the fragments of my reality, I carried with me the somber knowledge that my journey had just taken on its most daunting purpose yet. I must stand vigilant in the face of deception, nurturing the honest communion with the divine that I had discovered, and urging others to seek the truth beneath all false promises. The future, I knew, was not determined by the spectacle on the stage, but by the quiet resolve of hearts guided by an authentic, uncorrupted light. In that weighty silence following the vision, the call to resistance echoed louder than ever. The future deception was coming, but with it came a choice to surrender or to fight for the purity of faith. Gabriel resolved to do everything in my power to ensure that the light of honest belief would prevail over the shadows of manipulation. I awoke to the harsh beeping of hospital monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the ethereal realms I had just traversed. In one overwhelming instant, I was pulled back to the tangible, painful reality of my body. The vivid clarity of my visions began to blur into the bleeding light of a waking day, as I found myself lying in a hospital bed, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest like a frantic drum, and every cell of my being reminded me that I was alive again. Yet, even as I opened my eyes to the familiar hospital room, I felt forever changed by what I had experienced. The return was tumultuous. My mind was a storm of memories from both realms. I remembered the sensation of leaving my body behind, the disembodied weightlessness of floating in an endless void, and then the overwhelming embrace of that divine light. Here, tethered to a fragile human form, and the pain of my collapsed chest was a grim reminder that my journey through death had not been an escape but a transformation. I struggled to reconcile the surreal encounter with the concrete reality of the hospital linen and the concerned faces hovering at my bedside. My family gathered around me, disbelief mingling with relief in their eyes. They asked anxious questions in hushed tones, their voices trembling with both hope and fear. I tried to speak, to tell them of the incredible visions, but every word felt inadequate, weighed down by the enormity of what I had witnessed. How could I explain that I had seen the mingled corruption of centuries-old institutions, images of decadent halls and secret pacts, with the pure truth of a humble gathered congregation that embodied the true spirit of divine communion? I watched my mother's tearful gaze and my father's hesitant nod, and I realized that conveying such revelations would be a lonely, uphill battle. Over the following days, as I recovered from the physical wounds of my near-death episode, the vision of my celestial journey became a fixed presence in my thoughts. Sleep brought neither solace nor escape. Instead, the line between waking and dreaming had blurred, allowing me to revisit that mysterious space where the divine had spoken to me. I recalled the acceptance in Jesus' eyes, the divine command to leave behind blind adherence to corrupted institutions, and the plea that I bear the truth to those still lost in darkness. That calling burned within me. I knew I was chosen to carry a message that transcended the comfort of tradition, a mission to warn of impending deception fueled by ambitious control. It wasn't long before I took tentative steps outside the hospital. The world looked the same, yet everything had shifted. Faces in the streets blurred into a mass of routine figures, yet I saw in them the same vulnerability I'd witnessed in the future deception. I began out to those I trusted, friends, a few devout acquaintances, and even that small group I once considered the heart of the true church. At first, my words were met with incredulity and silence. "Are you sure this wasn't just the delirium of your near-death state?" many would ask. Their skepticism stung, and I realized how hard it would be to awaken those enchanted by the comfort of an institution that had fed them lies for generations. Each conversation became both a mission and a test of faith. I recounted every detail of the visions, from the cold, oppressive halls corrupted by greed to the simple and genuine gatherings illuminated by the genuine presence of Jesus. I explained that real spirituality is not confined to ornate rituals or dictated by the faces behind elaborate altars. It is found in the honest, personal connection between each individual and the divine. I emphasized salvation lies not in blindly following men, but in listening to the unyielding whisper of the Holy Spirit, a message that had echoed through my soul that day in the void and returned with fervor. As I labored to share this truth, a deep internal conflict raged within me. I longed for those around me to understand the urgency of the message, yet I was met with defenses and at times outright hostility. The very institutions I had once revered now appeared as formidable barriers, bolstered by tradition and power. I often found myself isolated, voicing the discomforting reality that truth comes with sacrifice. Yet the divine light I had experienced would not let me falter. Even in the face of scorn or dismissal, the memory of that brilliant, all-encompassing warmth spurred me onward. I had been chosen to be a harbinger, to serve as a living testament to the power of a reformed faith, one unburdened by corrupted authority. Night after night, as I lay awake, I wrestled with the magnitude of my responsibility. The truth was to invite resistance, to challenge not only deep-seated beliefs, but also the very foundations of power that many clung to for comfort. And yet, in the quiet solitude of my recovery, I felt a resurgence of determination. I understood that the mission bestowed upon me was greater than my individual suffering. It was a call to liberate hearts, to awaken minds, and to reveal that the path to divine understanding requires courage and introspection, far beyond the empty rituals of blind faith. I began to document my experiences meticulously, writing down every detail of the visions, every interaction with the divine, and every moment of introspection that followed. My goal was not merely to recount a personal near-death experience, but to craft a message that could resonate deeply with anyone open to it. I distributed these writings to anyone willing to listen, hoping that the authenticity of my testimony would pierce the veils of complacency. Even as many dismissed my words as the fevered imaginings of a mind recovering from trauma, I persisted. I was convinced that if even a few could be touched, if even a single soul could be stirred to seek true communion with the divine, then the burden of my revelation would not have been. And so, as I continue my journey in the wake of resurrection, both physical and spiritual, I walk with a heart burdened with the sacred duty to sound the call for awakening in a world so desperately in need of truth. The mission is daunting and the road ahead is fraught with resistance. But I am Gabriel, a man reborn with the light of divine truth, and I will not be silenced. In the weeks and months following my return, I found myself standing at a precipice, a point of no return where the old life of ingrained routine and unquestioning tradition could no longer hold me back. Each day, as I walked through familiar streets that now seemed tinted with a new light, I felt an inner stirring that could only be described as transformation. Abyss, experienced the divine radiance, and witnessed the decay of institutions I once held sacred. Now, the time had come to choose a new path, one that was built not on blind obedience but on conscious personal conviction. I began to reconstruct my identity from the ground up. I no longer saw myself solely as a product of my upbringing or a disciple wandering through hallowed halls. I was now an active seeker, a messenger tasked with a mission far greater than my own suffering. My reawakening swept away the remnants of an old faith that had been tarnished by corruption and misplaced authority. In its place grew a vibrant, raw desire to connect with the divine in its truest essence, untainted by the machinations of power and tradition. I took to walking long, solitary paths at dawn, when the world was still quiet and the air carried the promise of renewal. In those moments, I meditated on the visions that had changed my life. I pondered the image of simple believers gathered together with open hearts, the command of Jesus' voice echoing in my mind, "Follow me, not the men." This command was no longer a distant echo from a sacred memory. It had become my personal clarion call. With each step, I felt more confident in pursuing a life defined by sincerity and genuine connection, rather than ritual and formality. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without pain. I encountered many who could not fathom the shift in my beliefs. Friends, family, and even some of the very people I had once revered. Their questions and, at times, condemnations served as constant reminders of the deep-rooted traditions I was challenging. Yet I no longer feared rejection. Instead, I embraced the discomfort as an integral part of forging a new, authentic self. Every challenge became a lesson, each moment of doubt a stepping stone toward a more profound conviction. I began to share my journey, sometimes hesitantly at first, with a small group of like-minded seekers. We met informally in quiet community centers or even outdoors beneath starry skies. The gatherings were modest, no altars of gold, monuments to man's authority, but rather conversations marked by openness and the shared yearning for truth. It was in these humble circles that I found my true community, a congregation of souls unburdened by hierarchy, where every voice mattered, and where the divine presence was experienced as an intimate living reality rather than a distant spectacle. As I recounted my near-death experience and the subsequent visions, I noticed a subtle yet profound transformation in those who listened. Eyes that once carried the weight of unquestioning tradition now began to glimmer with curiosity and, at times, even hope. I realized that my testimony was not merely a recounting of extraordinary events, but a spark that challenged others to reflect on their own spiritual dormancy. I encouraged them to question, to seek beyond the superficial layers of ritual, and to feel the profound presence of the divine in their everyday lives. This new path, I also confronted the darkness that had once filled my visions, the future deception that I had foreseen. I understood that the allure of false peace and controlled unity would forever be a challenge, not only for me but for all who would dare to live authentically. But rather than allowing fear to take root, I chose to see it as a call for vigilance, a reminder that the battle for true spirituality is fought not in grand theaters of power, but in the quiet moments of individual choice. Every day, as I re-engaged with the world, I made a conscious choice to live a life that honored the light within, to stand resolute in the face of societal pressures, and to nurture the genuine spark of faith that lay dormant in every heart. There were days when the weight of my mission pressed heavily upon me, a reminder of the loneliness and isolation that often accompanies profound change. In those moments, I would return to solitude, sitting quietly by a flowing or beneath an ancient tree, and reaffirm my commitment in heartfelt prayer. I prayed for strength, for guidance, and for the courage to remain steadfast amidst the cacophony of doubts that sometimes threatened to drown out my inner voice. Now, as I look back on the journey that brought me here, I see it as a series of shattered illusions and reborn truths. I once believed in the infallibility of institutions, in the sacredness of rituals that had been handed down like heirlooms, but I now understand that true spirituality is not a relic of the past, locked away in timeless dogma, but a living, breathing force that evolves with each soul that chooses to embrace it. I have learned that the real church, the genuine community of believers, is not defined by a building or by titles, but by the authenticity of each individual's devotion and their unwavering commitment to live in the light of divine love. Forward into an uncertain future, I carry with me the knowledge that every choice matters. I have chosen a path of conscious rebellion against a system that sought to muzzle the divine spark within us. I am, and will forever be, a seeker, a person tirelessly striving to embody and share the truth that I have received. This new path is not paved with certainty, but with the promise of continual discovery and transformation. In the quiet assurance of my new beginning, I welcome each day as an invitation to walk further in the light, a light that, though it may flicker in the darkness, burns eternally within every heart that dares to seek it.